Imagine a king so terrified of being touched, he wrapped himself in iron rods and ordered his court to move in slow motion because he believed his body was made of glass. Not fragile, metaphorically, but literally. Welcome to the twisted world of Charles VI of France, the ruler whose mind cracked like a mirror and took a nation with it. This is not just a story about madness. It's a story about how one delusion shattered a kingdom. If you dare to uncover the truth buried in the ruins of a broken mind, hit subscribe now and let's begin. France, 1380. The 100 Years' War has left the land bloodied. Fields burn, cities crumble, the people starve while nobles feast. And into this chaos steps a boy only 11 years old. His name, Charles Valois. His title, King of France. His destiny far darker than anyone could imagine. But Charles wasn't born a monster. In fact, he was everything a kingdom could hope for. Clever, charming, and hungry to rule. They called him Charles the Beloved. At 20, he cast off the grip of his corrupt uncles and took real power. For the first time in years, there was hope in the air. A golden age whispered. He negotiated peace-crushed rebellions and married Isabeau of Bavaria, securing alliances across Europe. The court called him a miracle. France, for a moment, stood proud again. But in the shadows of his mind, something was already breaking. And no one saw it coming. August 5th, 1392. The forest of Le Mans. Charles rides with his army beneath swaying trees and buzzing flies. The heat is oppressive. A page exhausted drops a metal lance. It clinks against a helmet. Innocent. But that sound snaps something deep inside the king. His eyes roll back. His face twists. He shrieks, "Traitors kill the traitors!" And before anyone can stop him, Charles draws his sword and attacks his own men. Not in fear, with rage, he slashes, charges, even lunges at his own brother. Knights scream, blood spills. The king is possessed. For 4 hours, the battlefield is chaos. His generals beg him to stop. He sees none of them, not his advisors, not his wife, not his name. When he finally collapses shaking, he wakes to silence. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asks. He remembers nothing. The blood on his hands, the bruises on his brother vanished from his mind. The court is shaken. Priests whisper of curses. Doctors blame the heat. Alchemists recommend mercury. But something inside Charles has broken, and the cracks are only beginning to spread. He will have more episodes, darker ones. And each time a little more of the king disappears. In the weeks that follow, Charles becomes quieter, distant. He stares at walls for hours. Sometimes he forgets who he is. Other times he insists he's someone else, a farmer, a stable boy, even a knight from ancient Rome. He refuses to recognize his children. Isabeau finds herself married to a ghost. Then, one night he wakes up screaming. Guards rush in. He cowers in a corner sobbing. "Don't touch me," he pleads. "I'll break. I'm made of glass." And just like that, the delusion takes root. From this moment on, the King of France will live in terror of touch, convinced that a single handshake might shatter him into 1,000 shards. The royal court transforms overnight. Cushions are added to every chair, doorways widened. Servants are ordered to move slowly, speak softly, and never ever make sudden movements. They aren't attending a king. They're tiptoeing around a living chandelier. Charles begins wearing specially reinforced garments, thickly padded robes, doublets lined with iron rods. He walks like a fragile relic braced against the world. The monarch of France wrapped like a priceless vase. The court calls it protection, but in hushed tones they call it what it is: madness. Worse still, the episodes don't stop, they mutate. Some days Charles believes he's being hunted. Other days he forgets he has children. He sees phantoms in mirrors, screams at shadows. He forgets who his wife is. One moment, lucid, charming, clever the next, trembling in a corner begging not to be shattered. His advisors scramble to hide the truth. They rush decisions through during his rare moments of clarity. When he's lost in delusion, they forge his signature. France becomes a kingdom ruled by silence and pretense. The throne remains occupied, but not by a king, by a mask. Into this power vacuum steps Queen Isabeau. Beautiful, brilliant, and ambitious, she was once just a diplomatic bride. Now she becomes the architect of survival. But Isabeau doesn't just hold the crown together. She plays her own game and plays it well. Two factions rise, the Armagnacs loyal to the king's brother, and the Burgundians led by Duke John the Fearless. They claim to serve France. In truth, they serve themselves and Charles's madness. It's the perfect excuse to seize power, territory, and vengeance. While the king cowers behind padded walls, France descends into civil war. Towns are burned, noble families slaughtered, Paris turns into a battleground. All while the man meant to protect the nation believes he'll shatter from a gentle breeze. The bloodiest moment comes in 1407, Louis of Orléans. Charles' own brother is murdered in the streets, not in battle, not in self-defense, ambushed. But when the killer Duke John is confronted, he shrugs. It was necessary, he says. And nothing happens. The king is too far gone to avenge his own blood. Even Isabeau begins to lose control. She switches allegiances, betrays allies, makes deals with the English. At one point, she even disowns her son, claiming he's illegitimate. Historians still debate whose side she was truly on, but the result is the same chaos. And all the while, Charles watches confused, broken, drifting deeper into glass. Sometimes he reappears momentarily lucid. He asks why people are fighting, why the streets are on fire. Then he vanishes again. The court learns to live in limbo. Rulers rise and fall around him. Armies march, cities burn, and the King of France tiptoes through his palace, terrified of touch. The royal children, 12 in all, grow up in fear and confusion. Their father, once gentle, now stares through them like ghosts. When they approach, he backs away, clutching his robes. "Don't come closer," he whispers. "You'll crack me." They are raised not by a man, but by a myth, a story they're warned not to touch. Queen Isabeau tries to remind him who they are, your wife, your sons, your blood. But Charles stares through her like she's made of smoke. Some nights he calls her a demon. Other nights he asks why a stranger is sleeping in his chambers. The woman once envied across Europe now shares a bed with silence. Then come the identities. Charles doesn't just forget he's king. He insists he's someone else entirely. A peasant, a shoemaker, a knight named Thomas who never existed. He weaves entire backstories, accents, habits. Courtiers are forced to play along, nodding as if the ruler of France truly grew up herding goats. Foreign ambassadors arrive expecting diplomacy. Instead, they're greeted by a man wearing a blacksmith's apron, babbling about forge work. Royal decrees must still be signed, treaties approved, wars declared. But when the king thinks he's a fisherman from Normandy, bureaucracy becomes theater. The royal staff becomes a troupe of improvisational actors. If Charles believes he's a monk, they bring him bread and ask about his silent vows. If he's a dog trainer, they whistle and bark. Whatever role the king invents, the court performs. It's not politics, it's survival. And sometimes, with no warning, the play ends. Charles blinks. He's back. He apologizes. He weeps. He tries to rule. But by then, the damage is already done. Decisions made in his absence become law. Enemies are emboldened. The line between kingdom and tragedy fades. The nobles live in terror, not of war, but of the king's return. Because when Charles emerges from madness, he demands answers. Why is the treasury empty? Why are cities burning? Why is his brother dead? No one dares speak the truth. So they lie, and the lies pile like corpses on the battlefield. Meanwhile, England tightens its grip. With France locked in civil war and its king lost in delusion, the English march south. Paris teeters. The people despair. Their monarch can't hold a sword. He flinches at the sound of armor. And yet, all hope is not lost. Far to the south, a 17-year-old farm girl claims she hears the voice of an angel. Her name, Joan of Arc. She speaks of fire and crowns and holy missions. Most call her mad. But in a kingdom already ruled by madness, her certainty sounds like sanity. She says God told her to crown the Dauphin, Charles's son, and drive out the English. In any other time, she'd be dismissed, laughed at, burned. But in this time, when the king believes he's made of glass and the heir refuses to fight a girl with visions, begins to look like France's only hope. Joan rides not with armies but with prophecy. She marches through burned villages and ruined towns, her banner high, her words blazing. France will not fall, she declares. The Dauphin will wear the crown. And strangely, impossibly, people believe her. Because when kings fear their own reflections, even a peasant girl can become a messiah. By 1429, Charles VI is still alive but barely present. He no longer speaks of governance, only of glass. He sits in silence for hours watching sunlight through windows. Servants place pillows near corners just in case he falls. He whispers to himself, "If I break, the kingdom breaks with me." While he fades, Joan burns. She lifts the Dauphin Charles VII and marches with him toward Reims Cathedral. Not with a royal decree, but with divine fire. The people line the streets. Priests weep. The boy king stares in disbelief. He had waited for his father to save France, but it was a farm girl who delivered him to the altar. The coronation is thunderous. Bells ring across cities. Crowns are raised. France is not yet healed, but it is no longer lost. And behind the stained glass windows in a dim-lit chamber of Versailles, the old king hears the news. "My son is king," he murmurs. Then silence. He smiles for the first time in years, just for a moment, as if some part of him remembers who he was, as if the crown passed cleanly from one hand to the next. But the truth is darker. The kingdom was not inherited, it was rescued from him. Soon after the episode's return, Charles forgets again. This time, he insists he is dead. "Why am I walking if I've already shattered?" he mutters. They place blankets around his bed, fearing he might throw himself from the window, not to escape, but to test if the glass has already broken. Meanwhile, Joan is captured, betrayed, put on trial. Her visions are called heresy, her courage madness. She is burned at the stake. The fire devours her, but not her legend. France will remember her not as a girl who died, but as the only one brave enough to believe in a crown when the king could not. Charles hears of Joan's death and says nothing. Or perhaps he doesn't understand. He sees fire in the hearth and flinches. He asks if his limbs are cracking. "Did she touch me?" he whispers. "Am I still whole?" By 1422, after 42 years on the throne, Charles VI dies. No fanfare, no thunder, just silence. He fades like fog. The physicians write natural causes, but the truth, he died long before. The kingdom had just waited for the body to follow the mind. The court doesn't weep. Not really. They hold quiet ceremonies. The crown passes. The war continues. But deep beneath the stones of the palace, stories begin to bloom. Of the king who feared touch. The man made of glass. And how one cracked soul nearly shattered a nation. In the years that follow, France limps forward. The English still hold the north. The nobility is fractured beyond repair. The treasury is empty. The people are exhausted. And though Charles VII wears the crown, it sits heavy like a relic salvaged from the wreckage of a sinking ship. No one speaks of the Glass King. Not in official records, not in church, but in taverns and kitchens in the quiet hours of night they whisper of a man who forgot his name, of a ruler who wore armor not to fight but to keep from shattering, of a kingdom nearly lost to a single mind. Writers begin calling him Charles the Mad. Others, more merciful, say Charles the Suffering, but the truth lies somewhere in between. He was a man crowned too young, used by greedy men, and crushed by pressures no human could bear. His madness wasn't a curse. It was the echo of a system built on one fragile spine. Philosophers take note. If one man's delusion could destroy a nation, what does that say about monarchy itself? Political theorists begin whispering dangerous thoughts. Should one man truly hold such power? What happens when the king's mind turns against his own crown? And so, without meaning to Charles the 666 becomes a symbol not just of madness, but of vulnerability, of the thin thread between power and collapse. His glass body becomes a metaphor that would haunt European thought for centuries. Poets write of kings with crystal hearts. Playwrights dream of thrones balanced on mirrors. Doctors, too, begin studying his case. They pore over ancient chronicles, symptoms patterns. Some say schizophrenia, others bipolar disorder. A few argue it was neurological trauma from poisoning or malaria. But one thing is clear. Charles VI becomes the first great psychiatric case study of medieval Europe. Medical books describe his glass delusion as both metaphor and diagnosis. And then they find more cases nobles, scholars, even artists who feared they'd shatter. But Charles remains the most famous, the most tragic. Because he wasn't just any man, he was king. And when a king breaks, the world shakes with him. But here's the most haunting part. In his final lucid moment, Charles did something no one expected. He recognized his son, called him the true heir, gave him his blessing. It was a single thread of clarity offered like an apology, as if he knew what he'd done, as if, for just a breath, the glass turned back into flesh. The legacy of Charles VI isn't just a tale of delusion, it's a warning. That power cannot protect us from the chaos inside, that wealth, armies, titles mean nothing when the mind begins to slip, and that even kings can break. So, when you walk past a stained glass window or see your reflection fracture in a broken mirror, remember Charles. Not just the madman, but the boy who once brought hope. The husband who tried to return. The father who disappeared. The king who taught Europe that madness doesn't knock on the door, it slips quietly into the throne. In the centuries that follow, Charles VI's name drifts into shadow. History books mention his reign as a footnote of chaos tucked between wars and treaties. But the people, those who felt the ripple of his madness, kept the story alive. In song, in fable, in fear. Beware the king made of glass, they whispered. And yet his reign left something behind. Not glory, not conquest, but caution. A lesson carved into the stone of Versailles and echoed in the cracks of forgotten palaces that the mind of a single man can undo an empire. That madness at the top seeps downward through court, through city, through soul. Even Joan of Arc's legend is shaped by Charles's absence. Her sainthood is not just about faith, it's about filling the void he left behind. She didn't just fight the English. She replaced a father who had vanished into delusion. Her flame was brightest because the throne had gone dark. And still, people wondered, what if someone had helped him? What if instead of mocking or hiding his illness, the court had faced it? What if Charles had been treated not as a king with madness, but as a man with pain? These questions haunt us because we still fail to answer them today. Modern psychiatry reads his story like a textbook delusion dissociation, glass psychosis, trauma-triggered mania. But clinical labels can't capture the human wreckage, the crying children, the burning cities, the wife who watched her husband forget her name again and again. Because in the end, Charles VI didn't just lose himself. He lost everyone. His children grew up half-orphaned. His people turned against each other. His wife became a political machine. And all the while he wandered through velvet halls, padded like a cell, praying no one would bump into him. He feared the sound of footsteps, the clink of armor, the echo of laughter. He became a phantom in his own castle, both too fragile to touch and too dangerous to ignore. France became not a country, but a dream that kept shattering every time someone tried to hold it. But isn't that the terrifying truth of history? That the line between king and victim, between ruler and ruin, is thinner than we dare admit. That we dress our madness in crowns and call it divine right until it starts bleeding from the cracks. The story of Charles VI is not just medieval tragedy, it is prophecy. Because in every age there is someone convinced they are untouchable, someone too delicate for truth. And when we serve that delusion long enough, something always breaks. So maybe Charles wasn't the only one made of glass. Maybe the system that propped him up, the advisors, the titles, the rituals, was just as brittle. And maybe we still live among glass thrones, glass laws, glass empires, waiting for the next soft clang that shatters it all. In the archives of a dim chancery where dust settles like snow on cracked ledgers, Charles survives as contradictions, a decree with 2 signatures in 2 hands, a treaty sealed on a day he swore he was a blacksmith, a tax remitted during a week he refused to be touched. The clerks learned to write around absence to bind a kingdom with ribbon and wax when iron and will had failed. What the chroniclers never say outright is how ordinary people kept France alive. Bakers who opened ovens, though armies marched mothers who hid children when factions prowled monks who rang bells, as if sound alone could stitch a torn map. A country is not merely a crown and its wearer. It is a web of small refusals against collapse. And that is why the story didn't end in shards. Imagine the palace at dusk, tapers, spitting a draft coiling along stone. The king's silhouette fixed by a stained glass window he can't stop staring through. He lifts a hand, and the color paints his palm red and blue and gold, and he whispers to the glass as if it were kin, "If I am you and you are me, who breaks first?" Glass is beautiful, because it admits light and terrifying, because it remembers every pressure. Power is the same transparent, until it isn't resilient, until the hairline fracture races across the pane. And by the time anyone hears the spidering crack, the window of history is already falling in glittering rain. Walk Paris today, and you can still feel it at odd corners, the way courtyards hold their breath, the way galleries of the Louvre cradle crowns in glass coffins, the way a city that once obeyed a delusion now encloses its relics behind panes, as if atoning. Tourists press their fingers to vitrines, not seeing the joke. History makes we protect our past from our touch, because once a touch almost ruined us. He began as Charles the Beloved, eager, precise, a boy king who promised arithmetic to chaos. He ended as Charles the Mad, a man who taught his court choreography for fear, and between those names runs a single line like a flaw inside crystal, one clang in a summer forest, one sprint of steel against steel, and a rain turned into a long fall in slow motion. We want monsters we can point at, but madness at the summit is quieter, a signature that isn't a signature, a meeting that isn't a meeting, a decade that isn't ruled. The lesson is not that kings go mad, but that systems must be built to withstand the day they do, or else we become a nation arranging pillows while the roof comes down. Modern relevance isn't subtle. We still gamble futures on the psyches of solitary leaders, still mistake charisma for ballast, still build palaces of policy with no crossbeams of accountability. What horrors do we tolerate because speaking feels like tapping a window we fear to crack? So, hold this image: a corridor of night candles, guttering the hush of velvet and breath, and a sovereign in padded robes pausing at every corner as if the air itself were a threat. Outside, hoofbeats, shouts, banners in rain. Inside, a man too fragile for touch, and a country learning the cost of worshipping a body more than a duty. And if the story left a hairline in your own thoughts, good history is the hammer, and we are the pains. What will you strengthen before the next blow lands? Like, share, and comment to pull more of these black threads from the tapestry. Subscribe if you dare to keep walking the cold halls where crowns or heavy candles burn low, and the past still cuts like glass.